Welcome to Unfixed. This podcast explores the intersection of artificial intelligence and the institution of higher education. I am Zach Justice, Professor of Communication Studies and Director of Faculty Development.
And I'm Nik Janos, Professor of Sociology.
We are employees of Chico State, and we will discuss some of our work, but this podcast is not affiliated with Chico State, and the views expressed here are not representative of the university.
Zach, how are you doing today?
I am feeling fantastic. I love recording these podcasts. This time we get to spend together talking about something that I care about. I know that sounds cheesy, but I woke up looking at this on my calendar and thinking it's going to be a good day today.
Totally. Highlight of the week. All right, what do we got this week?
So today we're talking about the institutional adoption of artificial intelligence. And what we mean by that is a big organization, maybe a college or an entire university, entering into one of these agreements or partnerships with one of these mega companies or OpenAI to get everybody access or a limited group of people access, but a formal relationship between an institution and one of these tech companies.
Yes, it's definitely something we've been waiting for the last couple of years. Like, when would this happen? And it seems like now is that time.
Yeah, now is very much that time. This was kind of a big moment for us this past week at Chico State. We had our rollout here on campus. Nik, I know I had a little bit of a backstage view about this. How did you experience this sort of as a faculty member in the campus? Was this just a couple blippy emails, or did this feel like an event? Tell me how that worked.
You know, I'll just be honest. I think it was just a bunch of blippy emails, and I was plugged in following it. But I did speak to colleagues and up and down the stack, if you will, the chairs, deans, who were actually like, "What? It's rolling out next week?" And not knowing that this big change was coming. And I think that has been an interesting thing where I would bring it up at faculty meeting, like, don't forget next week. So I actually sent all my colleagues in my department a long emails like, here's my experience. I got early access. You and I got early access with some other people on campus for ChatGPT EDU. And I was like, this is the things you want to pay attention to. Here's what you might want to talk with your students. So I think from that faculty perspective, I think there's been a lot of uncertainty or just not knowing what was coming and what it might mean for our jobs going forward.
I think that's fair. And just to back up, in case you're unfamiliar, what happened was that not just Chico State, but the entire CSU entered into an agreement with OpenAI. And that was announced in February, wherein every student, staff member, and faculty member and administrator in the system got access to a premium version of ChatGPT.
Well, just let's segue. I mean, to also context, think about this. We're talking about 500,000 license. So roughly 500,000 people are getting this access.
Yeah, even OpenAI remarked that this is the biggest relationship like this that they have entered into. It's not the first one, but the scale, and there's some other things that separate this out too that we'll get to. But that's the overall context. In terms of what happened here at Chico State, there were a couple of lead-in events that were mainly run by our partners in IT that tried to get the campus ready and excited in some instances for this. And it sort of culminated with what they called Immersion Day. And this is kind of typical of these rollouts at different campuses, where you have a half day or a day of events where people are doing demonstrations. You have people that are there that are the vendors, and they're answering questions and showing off different things. And I was able to be there for a good chunk of the day, met two people from OpenAI, so that was kind of cool. And one of them is a Chico State alum.
Oh, wow.
That's cool. Yeah, which I think that kind of eased some of the tension in the room because people felt like, oh, this person's one of us. There were some parts about that went really well. Like the two guys from OpenAI did a really nice job sort of showcasing some different stuff, talking about their experience on different campuses. There were some parts that everyone could have done without. I know I bag on them all the time, but EAB was there and their presentation was awful. It could have been, it was the most generic thing you could have seen at any university or institution anywhere. And I don't expect them to say, like, here's some special thing just for Chico State, but there were things that they were suggesting that wouldn't happen on a shared governance collective bargaining campus. And it just made me think that a lot of this stuff really does need to be localized for context in a way that isn't always visible to these national tech organizations and consulting outfits.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the layers we can get to. in that. Just a small story. My wife is currently a student at CSU Long Beach, getting another teaching credential for library studies. And I was asking her, I was like, oh, so are they getting prepped? Are you getting emails? Are they doing trainings? And they didn't really get an email until after they launched it. And then they was saying, hey, we got these trainings. So I think the messaging around this is not actually what I expected it to be. And I think at the end of it, it was kind of like, well, here it is. Here's a few things. And like, let's figure it out. So I kind of feel like there's a lot of work to still at campus, across campuses, that need to kind of like be done to incorporate this into our new work environment.
Yeah, I totally agree. And while parts of this aren't great and parts of this are complicated, I'm trying to see this as an opportunity. And I want to see us make the most of this opportunity to sort of try this out as a campus, see what works, see what doesn't. And I'm really hoping that with some better collective effort, we can increase the currency of the faculty. And I think that's been one of the goals, not just at Chico State, but at other campuses that have entered into the agreement. So we want to contextualize the CSU rollout in a sort of national narrative. So there have been, as I mentioned, other institutions that have done AI integrations or tried to make themselves an AI-ready campus. I think first out the gate was Arizona State, just as they are for almost anything. I think a couple months after ChatGPT launched, Sam Altman was at ASU shaking hands with Michael Crow, and they had some sort of formal relationship, which is just, it's sort of mind-blowing how fast they move in these spaces. Again, not a collective bargaining or shared governance campus. So one of the reasons why they are able to innovate and some of these other campuses are is because there are less constraints than there are in the CSU. But they weren't alone. University of Florida rolled their piece out. University of Michigan did something really interesting. They have a in-house large language model that is built on the ChatGPT infrastructure. And then they also have brought in experts. Bonnie Stachowiak hosts the Teaching and Learning in Higher Ed podcast. It's something that I listen to regularly. They brought her in as a professor in residence. She's not necessarily an AI expert, but she's one of the foremost voices in the country about teaching and learning. She's hosted lots of great people about AI. And so bring her in, I think, was helpful for the campus in sort of centering teaching and learning and also helping to get people on side. And it really showed an institutional commitment. Like in my observation, how University of Michigan has done this kind of stands out as a way that you can do that and invest and sort of make it feel like it's your own.
Yeah, no, I think that's something we'll get to, but it does raise that point about, do universities introduce these technologies along a humanist path where we're talking about how are human beings going to use and interact with these new technologies? Or did they do it on a technological path that says, here's the technologies, let's push it into people's lives and then figure out what happens next? And I think there's different models, right?
Right.
And
should we call one the Long Beach model?
Yeah, exactly. And
everybody, it's on.
So I wrote a piece just when it was announced. Basically, it's called "Reflections: Thoughts on the First AI-Powered University." So CSU Chico or CSU System, the chancellor released a press release announcing this, and they said they're the first AI-powered university. So I said, what does that mean? What is that? What could this change? And as a sociologist, I'm always thinking about norms of behavior, norms of attention, norms of behavior, like what humans how do we create the boundaries of what's acceptable and unacceptable? And clearly we've been in sort of Wild West time since the introduction of ChatGPT. So we've kind of been in that classic normlessness, but in that some new patterns have emerged already around students' use of AI that have set in for 2 years now. Some bad norms, some good, right? And we're all figuring it out. So I thought that one thing that this officialization, if you will, of ChatGPT at the university is going to start actually crystallizing, hopefully, through our conversations, through our practices, new norms of how we use them, how we talk about them. But, that's one area that I'm really keen to kind of see how that goes and being part of that conversation.
Nik, you had a metaphor in there or a sort of framing mechanism about AI as infrastructure. Can you unpack that real quick?
Yeah, I kind of, when we think about infrastructures like electricity or even the internet, like these are large scale platforms of which other things are built on top of, right? They become foundational layers. And I think that one of the things around this is that it becomes a new foundational layer for all the kinds of work that we do, of which new kinds of tasks and jobs and ways that we lose old tasks and jobs, which we've talked about on the podcast, are really going to accelerate, right? You think about like when electricity was introduced, think about all the things that humans no longer had to do once they had electricity, right? The same with the internet. So I think that this becomes that, and we talked about in another one of the episodes around work, and I think one of the things that this will, certainly create efficiencies, but I called it sort of, is this a rebound? And we made the joke last time about Jevons paradox, not to keep bringing that up, everyone's favorite paradox. No, but it certainly is possible that, right, we're going to see, oh, you can do more now, so here's more to do. And I think, what I like us to kind of like, one of the things that I took away from this announcement was really around the idea of what does AI leadership mean at the institutional level? What does it mean to be an AI-powered university? What is the appropriate relationship between administrators and faculty who are actually deploying the tools in classrooms and so on and so forth? That's kind of like where I think, the frontier of the conversation is really happening.
Yeah, so that brings us to this big picture point, which is why do institutions centralize their AI rollouts? And I'll start with one that's sort of personal, is that something that we know from survey data about people in doing knowledge work is everybody's bringing this technology to their job, whether it is in an official capacity or an unofficial one. And whether you want to say that's innovation or guilty, but Nik and I are both guilty of that, right? Like we were rolling out AI tools for our own efficiency and exploration and university work from the start. We weren't just thinking about how our students are using these things, but I was starting to think about how am I going to use these things? And I would like to think that my use has been pretty responsible, but I'm sure there are people at different universities that are uploading student data into these systems and are uploading. Before I really understood what was going on, I uploaded stuff that was copyrighted that I would like download from a database and that I would upload to ChatGPT to ask questions and unpack, find connections, that kind of stuff. And it wasn't until I was talking to some folks in information security that I started to realize, oh, when you do that, then you've taken something that's copyrighted and now it's part of a training data set for this company. And there are all these lawsuits that everyone's embroiled in about whether or not they should have access to these things. So I think that's one of the reasons why institutions do this, is that they understand people like us are trying to innovate and bring these tools to their work all the time. And this is a way to sort of bring some standardization to that, rather than just having us all out there making it up as we go.
Obviously, to minimize risks to the institutions itself. And one thing that I'll bring it back to the norms. Like, I think sometimes centralizing authorities do help structure what is acceptable and not acceptable. Now, obviously, in history, that can go bad, right? But I think one of the things that I've thought is that in that sort of Wild West, cliche, people are using it. It's like with like drugs, right? People are going to use them whether legal or illegal, And so the question is, like, where do we move that line to create which kind of boundaries? Because I don't think we still know, Zach, like what is the appropriate use? Where is that line? And what is the appropriate line to draw? But we're not going to talk about that unless we have above ground, officially kind of organized venues to do that at the university.
I was just thinking that, we certainly have some colleagues that have been unhappy with this relationship that the CSU has entered into and just unhappy with AI in general. And you saying that makes me think that they would prefer an announcement that says, we're an AI abstinent institution and system, and then we could have done a bunch of abstinence only education for AI.
Right. No, I'm sure there's people that probably think that. And we're not arguing that we're just like plug it into the back of our brain and just like upload everything into ChatGPT or something. But I think, I'm interested in that sort of like you brought up this sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom idea. So we, preserving the spaces of autonomy and experimentation are certainly really important. And there's other models. I think, one critique of this is that OpenAI is the leading, most powerful company right now in AI, and CSU system made a deal with them. And there's a whole bunch of other baggage that comes along with that: political, cultural, and technological lock-in potentials, right? So I understand those concerns, right?
I want to get really concrete about one thing before we move on to what could possibly go wrong, which is that when we're talking about the data security piece, one of the things that is the perk for institutions, the CSU included, is that when we enter into these agreements, one of the things that happens is that we're sort of existing in its own cordon off space of the server infrastructure, so that then when we are uploading stuff, then that doesn't become part of the training set for OpenAI in the future. And so that obviously gives the information security people a little bit of breathing room, and it makes us, I think different institutions have different concerns and goals, right? Like if we were at Florida or Michigan, we're mainly concerned about research productivity, right? And so they're worried about, we developed this cool thing and now we've sort of lost control of it because that's now become part of a training data set.
Yeah.
We're primarily, we do research here. Shout out to Nik. He's finishing his second book right now. But we're primarily a teaching institution, and I think that we have a lot of concerns about student data.
Yeah.
So
I'll chime in there because you mentioned my book. So since you mentioned it, but once we got the EDU license, this changed my relationship with ChatGPT. Once I migrated my account over into the EDU account, I then felt more comfortable putting parts of my book manuscript for review, like, hey, what am I saying here? Or think about this, right? Because I was like, well, I'm not just sending it out into the ether to then be used by other people, right? So I think even in research, for sure, in my own work, definitely. And then you're absolutely right, the student data. So when people say, when they ask me, they're like, Nik, tell me about this. Like, why are we doing the EDU thing? What is it? I said, my basically open line is, well, the best perk you get is that it's not what you put in there is not used for training data. Now, could that change? I'm sure it could change. Do we, we don't know what the longevity of what happens to that data once let's say we lose the license, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot to work out there, but I think that's the best case right now for using the EDU license.
So that transitions us pretty quickly and nicely to what could possibly go wrong. So Nik, you and I both read some of Rob Nelson's work, and he was early to offer critique for this relationship between the CSU and OpenAI. Do you have a quick summary of some of Rob's work? And we'll link to his pieces in the show notes.
Yeah, I think there's a number, like maybe a couple big points that I took away around going back to what I've been talking about earlier in terms of, we're dealing with for-profit companies, and there's questions around control, around integrating corporations further into the university, certainly cost. I mean, we looked at the price tag. I off the top of my head, I think it's something like 19 million for
16.9.
16.9. Knew there was a 9 in there.
Yeah,
16.9 over a year and a half. In a time where there are budget cuts and things like that. So, I think Rob is also interested in that sort of 1,000 flowers bloom where, do we want a situation in which we're all using the same models, the same tools, rather than thinking about what other kind of models exist out there that are, doing other capabilities or have less, powerful entanglements that we might get ourselves into. Those are some of the ones that kind of like jumped to me. What stood out to you?
So he wrote a couple posts about this, and the first one that he wrote, one of the things that he pointed out was that $16.9 million is a huge amount of money to the CSU, especially, like you said, in times of budget cuts. It is an inconsequential amount of money to OpenAI. We could probably forget to pay them and they would not notice, right? Mm-hmm. So he had the question of what is the alignment here? And then he sort of spelled that out a little bit more in a follow-up post about that. What we're seeking from this, I think is debatable, but I think, Nik and I both pointed to some reasonable expectations and perks that systems get from this. But he was really asking the question, like, what does OpenAI get from this? Because I don't think $16.9 million is the thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if it is the sort of early adoption, like how Google puts Chromebooks in the hands of so many kids in K-12.
Yeah. I
don't know if it is some sort of legitimacy or the idea that, I mean, this isn't, I don't think this is a cynical take at all to think, where I generally landed with this is that if you had this generation of people who are going to be young professionals in the next 2, 3, 4 years, and they all have gotten used to using ChatGPT as an assistant for all of their knowledge work, they're going to take that with them to the workforce.
Well, even that, Zach, imagine entering college at you're 18 and then you have 4 years of chat history and you leave college. What are you going to go to, Gemini? Are you going to go to, another model? No, you're probably, going to you're locked in. So I think that's exactly why, Chromebooks and Apple iPads, I mean, these are platform lock-in building. Are they interested in education? Yeah, maybe in some capacity, but that's the alignment mismatch. The University of California the California State University is designed to educate. That's the core mission, right? OpenAI is not, of course, designed. Their mission statement is not about education. And frankly, what we've talked about on the podcast and everybody's talking about is, does this upend education as we know it? So the alignment problem is pretty far off, I'd say.
Yeah.
So that's definitely an area, sort of a red flag. But there was other other points he made that I thought were interesting, and you had a little bit more to say on that.
Well, yeah, and there are concerns here outside of Rob's stuff too. He's not a singular voice on this. One of the most visceral reactions that we have seen to this relationship is actually from our union, the California Faculty Association, of which Nik and I are both a part. Like, I've been a union member since I came here. They have had an extremely visceral reaction to this, and I understand part of that because there are these concerns about workforce displacement, and their job is to protect the job and livelihood and workplaces of us as faculty. And you can definitely imagine a world where, as we explored previously, there are changes in workload that result in fewer faculty being employed. That's their job, is to keep faculty employed. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I will just be honest, I've been disappointed with some of their reactions. Some of the stuff that they have said is just factually inaccurate, like that this mandates AI usage throughout the system. And there's nothing like that. You don't even have to activate your ChatGPT account,
right? Yeah.
Let alone use it in class or something like that. And I, part of what they do has to be about getting attention and making the voice of the faculty heard. But I've been a little bit uneasy with how they've expressed their discontent.
Yeah, certainly, and part of it is that fear or unease about the future of the university coming through in that, which we've written about and spoken about, but. I think whether it's Rob and if others have been arguing too around, we've just kind of come out of the hyper computerization period where everything is becoming a computer, and ed tech has taken a large role at universities. There was like the time period where I called it iPad Keynesianism, where like if you want an iPad, they're just like handing them out like candy, maybe like 15 years ago. So I think that the role of ed tech in universities is a legitimate topic of concern. And I think that goes back to like, how is this rolled out? If the tech departments were rolling it out, not to say that they can't do a good job, but it has a tech forward focus. If faculty and faculty affairs are rolling these tools out, then it begins to take on a pedagogical, a research focus, a focus of sort of core mission of the university. And those things certainly can be at odds. Not to mention also people are concerned about the ecological footprint, the energy use. We're not going to get into that, but those are also critiques that people have had. And actually, I think that one conversation I want to have with my colleagues in my department is, I haven't got it yet, but at some point I'll get an email that says, I ethically don't want to use ChatGPT because of its carbon footprint. Absolutely. Now, I don't think that that's a strong argument, because I don't think that the carbon footprint is the reason you may or may not want to use it, but we're going to get those emails. And I have to think about what's a thoughtful way to engage with that student who says something like that, right?
Yeah.
So that's one certainly that's gaining importance.
All right, we've talked long enough. I'm certainly tired of listening to you, Nik. what are your big takeaways about institutional adoption?
Well, we won't know for a while what the outcomes are, but I think it is a pretty big change and a significant one. I know people are kind of poo-pooing it or whatever, but I think it does signal a new priority for the university. And I am going to be obviously following along and seeing how in the classroom this filters down to our students, if at all. I think we didn't even talk about, but one of the big takeaways is I think students were already using it. So none of this is new. They just they're launching something, well, whatever. So kind of my big takeaways are, it's already here, it's already ingrained, and now it's official. Now we can actually really have those above the board conversations about how we're going to use these tools, what it will mean for the university going forward. What about you?
Well, my big takeaway is actually a point that you made in the context of this that we've kind of talked around, but I think you verbalized it more clearly than either one of us has spoken it out loud so far. And that's that if we want teaching and learning to be part of institutional adoption, there has to be teaching and learning leadership of this. And that doesn't mean that there's not a role for IT. Like obviously they're central to a bunch of this, but we need teaching and learning sort of leaders and adopters and leadership. You and I've talked about this before. When an institution is committed to something, you see it, right? Like there are these big public events where there is quasi-mandatory attendance. There is money that's invested into things. Everybody talks about it in department meetings because it becomes central to the mission of what we're doing as a campus. And if we want that sort of traction, especially with what we do in the classroom, we will need some of those sort of total institutional efforts like we've seen around other issues, like around the Graduation Initiative 2025 or other pieces like that.
Yeah, when you told me that the other day, I was like super convinced. Like this maybe is just the start. And if we get more of that, then I think we're on the right path.
So it is time for some irresponsible speculation, and I've got the one this time. The big perk of this for institutions is data security, that your data doesn't become part of training data. And I think that sounds nice, but I also think that, number one, these companies make huge mistakes with their data all the time. And number two, they change the rules, and sometimes they tell us and sometimes they don't. And that has happened numerous high-profile times in the world of AI. OpenAI, for its entire existence, has been a not-for-profit entity trying to bring about ethical artificial general intelligence until they decided, hey, we'd actually like to make a ton of money. Let's change our status to for-profit. But I think the scariest example of this is what Google did when they were training Gemini. They had a rule in place in the in-license user agreement of YouTube that you couldn't basically use those transcripts for profit. But then they realized they would really like to use that for training data, so they just changed that and then they didn't tell anybody, or maybe it was something that you clicked on when you're trying to watch a movie trailer on YouTube or something, but nobody paid attention, and then they transcribed all of YouTube and used that as training data. So the truth is, like, these companies, they aren't the government, they aren't a higher ed institution. They change the rules all the time and they don't tell us. So my bet is that sometime soon, we're going to find out that some of the training data that is at some of these universities, or some of the data that's been uploaded, is now training data.
Yeah, that seems very reasonable. I would also go and say that at some point we'll have the first scandal where an AI model's data is compromised, and whether that was a foreign, government or other, nefarious organizations. We haven't had that kind of data breach at this level, but that could also happen as well.
Yeah, and then my daughter's going to know that I'm not writing all those really thoughtful poems for her, but I'm actually having ChatGPT do all of it.
Think of how many divorces are going to happen after that.
Oh my God.
Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. You can find our writing on meltsintoair.org and connect with us on Blue Sky at meltsintoair.bsky.social and on LinkedIn, Zach Justice and Nik Janos. Find these links and more in the show notes. If you have feedback or want to share an idea, email us at unfixed@meltsintoair.org. Thank you to Jamie Gunderson for producing and editing the show.